The Numinous Podcast with Carmen Spaniola.
Hi there, and welcome to the Numinous Podcast, where we have interesting conversations with everyday folks about the mystery of life. I'm your host, Carmen Spaniola, joining you from the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, in what's colonially known as Victoria, BC, Canada. Today, we're welcoming Eliza Robertson back for the third time on the show. She was here as part of Cosmic Tonic with Jasmine Richardson in 2020, when we were discussing the key transits that would affect the second half of that wild year. And she was here again in 2022, talking about writing with the stars and magic with the muses. Clearly, she's a favorite conversation partner of mine, and I'm delighted that she's the one to shepherd us through the gate as we begin a 7-part mini-series on planetary magic and propitiation for the days of the week. Since about the time Eliza first appeared on the show in 2020, I've been taking a closer look at AstroMagic and paying more attention to cultivating relationships with the planets that rule the days of the week. I paid particular attention in 2022, establishing an altar in my bedroom that pretty much became exclusively used at least for that purpose, and it's the altar that I visit pretty much every day. I have several in my house. I knew I had a bit of tricky astrological weather to navigate at the time of my book publication, so I set about offering devotion, especially to Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. So I was quite consistent Tuesday through Friday. I made talismans for each of those planets, so magical sort of power tools you could think of, or magical objects, and I made offerings on their days. And over time, I've added some of the Materia Magica from Spear and Sundry, which is an atelier founded by Caitlin Koppuck that makes magical materials at very specific astrologically timed moments to basically bottle the essence of those influences. And this year, 2023, I have incorporated other micro rituals into what has become basically my standard daily spiritual practice. So a few moments each day in conversation with and appreciation of the planet of the day. I'm not saying I haven't missed days. I've definitely have missed days. But I would say that every day I'm aware what day it is a day that I have thanked that planet for overlighting my life path that day. Longtime listeners of the podcast will know that it's been my daily practice for over a decade, I would say, to greet the sun and moon each day, which is fairly easy to remember to do because their presence and influence is so obvious. But adding the rest of the planets, one for each day of the week, has also been really easy to do, actually. And my friends, which devotional spiritual practice is the most effective, more effective than any other devotional spiritual practice? Whichever one you'll actually do. So, let's get things started with Eliza. Eliza is a successful Canadian writer whose work has been praised by the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, and the National Post. Her most recent book is a true crime story called I Got a Name, a story that exposes fractures in a legal system that repeatedly fails to protect women. And in the book, she revives the search for a murderer still at large, likely aided and protected by accomplices whose smooth use of Southern charm and hospitality and sleight of hand remind us that patriarchy is always afoot and will stop at nothing to protect itself. So read that book, I Got a Name, if only as a sobering lesson in just trusting your own intuition and following the signs when you see them. I got to the end of that book and I really felt like the wool had been pulled over my eyes when I read the last part, and I can only imagine how Eliza felt. Ugh, so frustrating. Anyway, if you like true crime, you're going to love that book. She's also an astrologer. So let's get back to the planets. We're starting this series with the sun. Now, when we talk of planets in astrology, the sun and moon are considered planets. And when we speak of the luminaries, we might need to clarify what we mean by luminaries. So the ancient Greeks sometimes referred to the 7 classical planets, sometimes called the 7 traditional planets, as the luminaries. So these are the planets visible by the naked eye. However, more commonly in Hellenistic and modern astrology, when we speak of the luminaries, we simply mean the sun and the moon. So the 2 celestial bodies that throw and reflect enough light to create diurnal changes on Earth, meaning a shift between day and night. Medieval Western astrologers used the astrology of sect to distinguish between day planets and night planets. The Arabic astrologers had like a different system of sect, but sticking with something a little closer to my heritage, and just to describe it briefly, the diurnal sect were the daytime planets ruled by the sun that include Jupiter and Saturn. The nocturnal sect were ruled by the moon, and that includes Venus and Mars. Mercury was like kind of ambidextrous in this way, sometimes included in solar, sometimes in the lunar. But sect is a way of describing polarity. And maybe I'll ask one of our upcoming guests about that to explain more about that. But anyway, we're starting with the sun because it has such a major influence over our solar system, right? So I'm going to try to make sure to slow down and circle back to clarify terms for folks who are newer to astrology. I'm not an astrologer. You do not have to be an astrology buff to enjoy an animistic relationship with the planets. I'm just a person who loves knowing the associations and attributions of the planets to expand my understanding of the nature of the planets and to deepen my relationship with them. So I very much start with, Wikipedia, learning about the attributes of the actual rock in space. And then I kind of build out from there all the mythology that we have developed and stories we've developed around those planets, and then the astrology. So wherever your interest lies, you can just plug right in, and you'll see over time we're going to add plants and rituals, and we're going to talk about all the different ways that you can cultivate a deeper relationship with the planets that rule the days of the week. So I hope you'll enjoy this series too. Let's get started here with Eliza. Oh, Eliza, I'm so happy to have you back, but I'm still going to ask this question. What identities do you lead with now?
I think that my answer to that question is probably the same as the last time you asked it. So, my lead identities, my dominant identities are twofold. I'm a writer and I'm an astrologer, and I will also slip witch in there, but it's not one I tend to lead with. It's my midnight identity. It's my moonlight identity. My solar identities, while we're on the subject, is writer and astrologer.
Beautiful. I love this lens. I'm so excited to have you lead us off in this month of planetary magic and propitiations. When I say it's a month, it's because that's what we're focusing on in the Numinous Network in one of the courses I offer there, the Numinous School. But you have probably been the most influential person for me personally in terms of getting very serious about propitiation and getting into relationship with the planets. My relationship with the planets is maybe a little less astrological, if I could say that. I think of it in a very animist way. Like I'm thinking of it as like, yes, these are the celestial bodies. This is what they're doing right now. And I know that's what astrology is about as well. But I've thought of it very much as a person who just like studies the planets and notices what they're doing and tries to make associations that way. I think it was when I was selecting dates for submitting my book proposal and for emailing agents and things like that when I was preparing to release or bring forth the Spirited Kitchen, that you said, well, there are certain dates and times that we could use. You could maybe propitiate Mercury. And we used electional astrology a lot. I did a lot of electional astrology with you for a couple years in the lead up to the launch of the book. So this feels almost like we're working backwards a little bit, like we've come a long way in me learning from you about planetary magic. So it feels great to have you start us off in relationship to the sun. So given that bigger context, maybe there's more you'd like to flesh out, but please let us know from your perspective, what does the sun represent in astrology? What does it rule? What does it relate to? Start us off on planetary magic and the sun.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm touched that I'm one of the people you think of in terms of astrological magic. There are so many incredible practitioners and thinkers out there within that realm. I am by no means towards the top of that list, I would say, but it is very dear to my heart. So I'm glad that it was something I was able to share with you and that it's had legs, that you've been continuing and digging deeper into that interest, because it is so powerful and it's so meaningful. And one reason why it's so powerful and so meaningful is because sometimes astrology can feel, not always and not when it's done well, but sometimes we can feel like passive recipients of the astrology, passive recipients of our own birth charts, but also of what the planets are doing now. And the whole raison d'etre of AstroMagic is that you don't have to be a passive recipient. You can be a co-creator. You can work with the energies and woo the energies and try to charm them into working with you, or at least mitigating some of the harm. So to the sun, and I actually feel quite gleeful to talk about the sun. It wasn't initially going to be the planet that I was going to talk about with you. But the sun has been the planet that I've worked with the longest. I realize for folks listening, I'm saying planet. That's because astrologers call all of the so-called traditional planets, including the sun, which is not really a planet, it's a star, and the moon, which is a satellite of Earth. I know this, but I'm speaking with my astrologer hat on, so I'm going to be calling it a planet because that's what the ancients thought of them all. So the sun, yes, I was saying that I have an extra special relationship with the sun, partly because in my natal chart, I have Leo rising, and the sun is the planet that rules Leo, which means the sun is my chart ruler, which, if this is a new concept for folks, your chart ruler is the planet that rules your ascendant. It rules your rising sign. And it was considered to be almost like an avatar figure, like a planetary guide or a steers person through your life. And so for me, that is the sun. And I've worked with it with that in mind for a few years now. But in terms of what it represents, so many things. One of the more obvious ones and more traditional ones is that the sun would represent the king. The sun represents this sort of central authority figure. What we can extrapolate from that now is any kind of sense of authority, any leadership figure, your own inner sense of authority, your own sense of confidence. When you look at Picatrix or Agrippa's books of occult philosophy, which are these two different magical texts from, I'm not going to know exactly the time period, but I want to say around the 1400s or 1500s. I might be getting that really wrong. A long time ago. They always recommend solar propitiations if you want to, say, curry favor from a noble or from someone higher up than you. Today, I think we can extrapolate that to mean like maybe you're applying for a job and you want a little solar boost. You want to really impress those people who have more power in that situation. A solar working would be really helpful. So we do solar workings for success, for visibility, for confidence, as I mentioned. If you want to, so publishing a book and you want lots of people to hear about it, you might work with the sun. But also, the sun gives life on Earth. It's not the only thing that does, but it's a very crucial thing that does. So it also represents vitality. And a lot of people work with the sun also for healing and to boost health. So you can do it for your, your very I don't want to say superficial, but sometimes we just want really basic things like I want to be famous, or I want my book to do well, or I want to get a bit more acclaim, and the sun can be helpful there. Or you could work with the sun to bring healing to yourself or to another person as well. So those are some initial associations. There are a lot more, but I want to pause and let you chime in or ask another question.
Well, I think maybe we've already used some language that some listeners might not know. So, could you talk a bit about like what is propitiation? Um, what is electional astrology? What's remedial magic? Like maybe we could give a bit of a glossary, at least of those three concepts, because I would say those are kind of like three things that I think about as pretty foundational to my AstroMagic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So propitiation. Let's start with that. Now, I'm gonna be totally upfront. I'm speaking to you with how I work with those words and how I work with those concepts. I don't even know if this is the dictionary definition of them. And I'm sorry if I'm veering off anyone's script. But propitiation to me is when you're asking someone or something for something. So that would be one way that we could work with the sun. I would also, so literally saying, you know, asking the sun to help you get that job, asking the sun to help you get more followers on Instagram, whatever it is. But there's another way you can form a relationship with the sun, which is the one I've been working with more on a long-term basis, which is simply focusing on relationship building. And so not just, I think multiple astrologers have used this metaphor. One person who comes to mind is Amaya Rourke. As I want to give credit where credit's due, but I'm not sure if she was the originator of it. Ideally, you want to steer clear of what Amaya and some others might call vending machine AstroMagic. So you don't just want to put in your quarter, I don't know what year I think it is, put in your $2 coin or your card and get out, the thing that you want. I mean, that might be effective initially, but I like to think of the planets as beings with whom you build a relationship, and you don't just knock on their door when you need something. So
I think of propitiation as making offerings. So I think of it as like, oh, I'm going to propitiate the sun by putting out, like I have these gold sparkly Jordan almonds, like wedding almonds, like, yeah. And to me, and they're like these golden almonds that I love. And so it's like, that's kind of my like, ne plus ultra, like my top notch creme de la creme offering that I'm like, here's a gift for the sun. And as you say, it's for relationship building, so that it's like basically I'm saying in different ways, I love you. And this is me mirroring you and your wondrousness back to you. And doing that like pretty consistent, like mine is a daily practice, so I would be doing that pretty much weekly, pulling my tarot card out that I have that represents the sun and putting all my yellow and golden things and putting like a pretty orange flower down, that sort of thing, or like using my orange aromatherapy that day, that kind of thing. And I think of the propitiation as maybe partly asking for stuff, but I think of it mainly as offering stuff. Acknowledgement is maybe another word that I would be using for that.
Yeah, what I was getting at, so I think the word propitiate this is where again I might be crossing signals or I'm getting confused. I think the word propitiate means to ask for something, but what I'm saying is that can be part of this richer and deeper practice, which is exactly what you're describing, which
Right.
is but I might even be wrong about that, but this wider
But in practice, yeah,
a devotional practice is really,
yes.
so I would call that devotion, or making offerings, relationship building. And that can, as you say, that's a beautiful offering at the gold almonds. I love that. And yes, flowers, solar flowers. So you can think of heliotropes like sunflowers, which literally follow the sun, or marigolds, or anything that evokes the sun for you. Often yellow, orange, even scarlet flowers can be very solar. I mean, this is now such a beautiful time of year, at least in this hemisphere, for picking your own flowers, for picking wildflowers. And in your area in Victoria, I mean, California poppies are everywhere. They were when I was down there a month ago.
Yeah, totally. Yes, they're everywhere. And calendula, Victoria's like basically most invasive flower, grows up like dandelions through the concrete. Love the calendula.
But even that act of going wildflower picking for the sun and choosing these solar flowers and gathering your own bouquet, or going into your garden if you have a garden, that to me feels like such a solar act in itself, because you're under the sun while you're doing it, and then you're gathering it for the sun. Lighting incense as well. Incense itself was a very exclusive and special offering. When you think of thousands of years ago, it was not cheap to get some frankincense resin or whatever other resin you are using. So it was very elite. This is just helpful context. It was very elite people who were performing AstroMagic, or who were hiring a magician to perform AstroMagic in the time period where Picatrix was written, or the 3 books of occult philosophy, which, as I'm thinking now, are not actually the same time periods, but here we are. History, I'm not a historian. Never claimed that in my list of identities. My brother is, and if he ever listens to this, he'd probably roll his eyes at me. Anyway, so yes, so that covers that one word. Electional astrology is when election just means to choose. That's why during an election for the government, we choose who we want to be representing us. So in electional astrology, instead of looking retrospectively at a chart, we are choosing the chart for a venture that we want to begin. So to send your book to an agent, we would choose the most auspicious chart, looking weeks or months in advance, sometimes years in advance, to choose this most special alignment of planets. And that itself is an act of magic, in my opinion. So you can do that to do very mundane, meaning worldly things, like sending your manuscript off, or sending your job application off, or buying a house, or putting in an offer for a house. All of these things you could, anything that you want to time, a delicate conversation, anything that you want to time, you could elect. And when we do astrological magic, we're often using an elected time to then create a talisman, or to do this propitiation. We can make it as simple or as splendid and adorned as we like. If you read some of these ancient texts, they will specify that you wear gold robes, or each planet has different specifications. Yes, what was the third one?
The third one was remedial magic.
So remediation is related to the above, and that's when often it doesn't have to only be for your natal chart, but often this is where we encounter it, where maybe we have a planet that's not doing so well in our chart. Maybe it's in its sign of detriment or fall, or maybe it's being squared by Saturn, or there's just something going on where that planet feels like it could use a little help. We can work with that planet to boost its energy. You could almost think of it like taking a supplement. Like if you're taking magnesium to boost your natural magnesium supplies, maybe you want to work with the sun to boost your natural solar supplies. And when it comes to the sun in particular, so the sun is one of 2 traditional planets that can't be retrograde, because the sun, it just can't. It doesn't move backward ever from our point of view on Earth. The moon is the other one, and it's because they're not actually planets. So you wouldn't ever be remediating that. But one thing you might want to remediate with the sun in particular is if you have the sun in one of the so-called hidden houses, especially I would say the 12th house or the 8th house. And I've noticed with folks who have 12th house suns that they can be a little more reticent to be seen. They can be a little more comfortable behind the scenes. And that can be absolutely fine. But sometimes what happens is there's actually a deep yearning to be seen and to be acknowledged and to be recognized. But the decisions they're making or just life, life presents itself in such a way where they're not receiving that positive attention or positive affirmation or acknowledgement. And that can feel, of course, really demoralizing. So I would work with the sun in that way to maybe boost not only the opportunities for visibility, but also our ability to tolerate and work with that visibility, because especially if you're not used to being visible, can feel very confronting to suddenly be in the spotlight. So the sun, remediating the sun, which could include some of those activities that we've mentioned. It could include reading the hymn, the Orphic hymn to the sun, or your own prayer that you write for the sun. Those could all be helpful activities to just, it's like exposure therapy
Right.
to get a little more used to being seen, or to court some of that energy so you're better able to be seen.
Okay. What if you are being seen for the like quote unquote wrong reasons? Like, what if you are, I don't know, you're called out on social media and suddenly you have like this much higher profile, but not for reasons you would want? Would you still be working with the sun for that? Or do you think you would be like, oh, I'm going to pull in a different planet because my sun is like too much right now?
Such an interesting question. I would want to look at what planets were involved. So as an astrologer, I'm always curious, what transit were you going through when this happened? Because that might be very revealing. If for example, actually, as we're recording this, last night and today, Mars is squaring Uranus, which is really a transit, if there was one, and there are others too. That is a transit where the rug gets pulled from under you, or I think it coincides with many natural events as well, like wildfires, which we're experiencing in Quebec. Montreal had the worst air quality in the world yesterday, which is kind of mind-boggling. It's normally one of the better places to be. Anyway, this to say that can manifest in many different ways, but it can be illuminating just to see what was happening. So you might want to work with an astrologer, because that will be indicative, therefore, with what planet you should be appeasing or toning down, or just kind of working with better. What I would say is, when we are called out, or if that situation happens where we're seen for something we don't want to be seen for, we're probably experiencing shame. And I think the sun could still be a very helpful ally for finding your confidence and finding your pride again, even in the face of that shame. But you might want to be working also with Jupiter or Venus or another planet, just as a protector, as someone to safeguard against visibility that you don't want. Because one thing I will say, so traditionally Jupiter and Venus are both called benefic planets. They both tend to be seen as helpers. The sun is not a benefic. It's not a malefic either. But I will say it can act as a malefic. If a planet, you see this in the sky, if a planet draws too close to the sun, which Venus is not yet doing, but will be doing soon, you can no longer see that planet in its own light. And these coincided with afflictions for the ancients called being under the beams. And then if you're really close to the sun, it's called combust. It's called a combustion. The only exception is if it's cazimi, if it's right in the heart of the sun, which is considered very powerful, but not necessarily a pleasant experience. It's more like a purification. Like the metaphor I always use is a lighter flame to sterilize the needle if you're 13 and going to pierce your ears or something. This to say, the sun is life-giving, but we get burnt by it. We get burnt by it all the time. So it's not, I think what you're describing is a really interesting scenario to think of, because sometimes we think we really want visibility, and then we get it and we realize it's not, maybe
Mhm.
that's not the kind of visibility that we wanted.
Right. When you're describing this, I'm thinking of Icarus flying
Mhm.
too close to the sun and the wax wings melting, and just how was his father Daedalus? I can't remember who, but anyway, just the
Yeah,
tragedy of that it's like, oh, too much of a good thing. And
exactly.
potentially the hubris. There's pride, but then there's hubris. There's anything can be out of whack. So when you say you've been working with the sun for a long time, what does
Uh-huh.
that mean? What does that look like in maybe a daily or monthly kind of practice, or
Yeah,
weekly, I guess?
I'm going to I'm going to answer that, but I want to comment on Icarus first because I I love that example, and two things come to mind. One, the sun, you see in that myth, the sun is extraordinarily magnetic. I mean, literally the solar system revolves around the sun. There's a great pull to keep revolving around this central star. Um, and that again relates to what we want to cultivate. Sometimes when we're doing solar magic, we want to cultivate a kind of magnetism, and we do want to draw, that's also Venus magic, but we do want to draw positive, ideally positive attention to us. But also what comes to mind is moths or any insect that's drawn to the flame, and you're just like, if you're one of those people like, which I am, where you kind of empathize with every animal getting killed, you're like, no, just stay away. Not what it's cracked up to be. If you're yeah, I've had this happen with candles, and then insects just errantly wander into the candle flame, and it's like, oh,
Oof.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but I wish you knew better.
Yeah. Yeah.
um anyway, what does my practice look like? I so it might be apparent in how you're releasing these episodes, but every planet has a planetary day. The sun's planetary day is Sunday. Um, and so my practice for the sun, I work with a few planets every week. The sun is one of them. And so every Sunday, I will, it can be pretty simple, but at the very minimum, I will light a candle, I'll light some incense, I'll read the Orphic Hymn to the Sun, and I'll meditate. And right now when I meditate, I'm just meditating, but I used to like to include a visualization, which could start with the candle flame, and the flame, being a sister to the sun in a way. It's of the same material. It's at least evocative, and just sort of trying to steady my gaze onto that flame, and then internalize that heat and that warmth, and imagining it at my heart center, because the heart does also have a correlation with the sun. It's called our solar plexus for a reason. This area, no one else can see what I'm doing, but you can. I'm pointing to my chest. And just visualizing that light and that warmth radiating outwards from my heart or from my solar plexus, and filling the room. So that's a visualization you can work with if it resonates. That's the minimum that I will do if I'm right now away from home and I don't have a bathtub, but I used to love taking solar baths.
Ooh. Ooh, that sounds good. What's that?
It's really simple, but it sounds extra magic when you call it a solar bath. So this happened, actually, I was making a solar talisman, and one thing I wanted to do was a paper talisman. So your talismans can be very modest. They don't have to be chiseled onto gold, as some of these ancient texts will recommend. I don't have lots of access to gold personally. But one thing I wanted to do is steep the paper that I was working with in solar herbs, just to add extra solar energy. So I was working with, I think I was working with chamomile and eyebright, which are both solar herbs. There are many others, but I was working with what I had on hand, and I ended up making a very heady concoction, in that there was a lot of chamomile compared to water, and I let it sit there for a long time, not even fully intentionally. I was just doing other things, and by the time I came back to it, it's sorry for the graphic detail, but it really looked like urine. It was this deep,
Oh, wow.
dehydrated urine. It was a deep yellow, probably unhealthy urine. But it was perfect for dyeing the paper, soaking the paper. And I ended up being left with this solar liquid, and I had left it in the sun as well. So it was literally taking in the sun's light. If you wanted to, you could add a piece of gold jewelry to that and add that as a way of kind of including the actual metal. Gold also has an association with the sun. But what I did with the leftover liquid, of which there was quite a lot, I just poured it into a bottle and I keep it in my fridge, and I'll just pour some out into bath water, and it still smells fragrant. I added a bit of frankincense oil, which is frankincense is also linked to the sun, and I'll pour that into my bath, and it just creates this lovely gold bath water. And you can put the actual herbs, the actual chamomile herbs, or St. John's wort is also very solar. But I'm one of those people where, I mean, that can be fun at the time, and then you have to clean it up, and I'm like, I'd rather not deal with it. So I like having this already herbed and drained
And like concentrated solar liquid.
That's the word I'm looking
Love
for.
that.
Concentrated. You could add, I like the idea actually of adding some marigolds, like actually adding the flowers or flower petals. That would be extra sumptuous and easier to clean up than loose chamomile herbs. But yes, that's my solar bath. So I would do that on a Sunday. There are planetary hours as well. So even if you don't work with electional astrology, you can still time this for the sun's hour on the sun's day. The app that I use is Hours. It's free, and you have to look at it for your location, and it will tell you when a given planetary hour will be. Honestly, I fit it in when I can. I'm not looking at the hour. I can't. As much as I would love to revolve my life around astrology and AstroMagic, I can't. So I just do it anytime on the sun's day is good enough for me.
Yeah, sometimes, I like the idea of starting my day with my magical practice, but very often what I realize is that's when my cognition is like quickest and best, and it's actually the better time for me to be writing or responding to emails or doing admin, anything where I have to be like on the ball. And so then anyway, this year, basically, I've given myself a break and been like, I won't really think about my magical practice until the afternoon. Like I'll kind of like work until whenever I try to pause for lunch. And then sometimes if I kind of have an open afternoon, then I'll go to the app and I'll I think I do the same thing. I just like Google planetary hours, and I think that's the one that comes up, and it's free. And then I'll be like, oh, okay, today Jupiter's hour is 4:00 or something like that. And so then I'll kind of like try to migrate my practice to that time if I can. But I generally don't worry too much about it. I try to hit the day, and that already feels like a big kind of success. If I'm doing my propitiation at the right day, like perfect, that feels like a pretty big offering already, particularly in modern times. And maybe that also really matters, that what was special and what would charm a planet in the year 1012 maybe different from what it is in 2023. It's a lot harder to do certain things. So yeah, I super appreciate that. Do you have like extra special, like high magic that you would do for the sun? Like, would you say like midsummer solstice or something like that? You are particularly like, okay, this is my Mac Daddy ritual for the sun for this period of time, or your birthday, maybe like when would be some like really appropriate times for bringing out all the best materia magica for working with the sun?
Yeah, I love that question. So I have my AstroMagic practice is separate from my more devotional I mean, I was going to say it's separate from my more devotional practice. That's not always the case, because I am very devotional towards the sun, and my astrological magic practice is still very devotional, but I have a completely separate practice that I do keep pretty separate, and that involves observing the wheel of the year. So I'm always observing the solstice, but it's not when I'm doing my solar working. I mean, I am, but not in a very different way.
Mm.
I'm tapping into a part of myself. I think that's a lot more intuitive and maybe even more focused on the body. AstroMagic can be very cerebral, especially if you do start working with charts and you're electing certain moments. And I like to just observe the subjective experience of the seasons and of the light. And that will still be a very solar practice, but for me, it's separate from my AstroMagic practice. I don't know if that distinction is clear, but so when I love the idea of doing solar magic on your birthday, on your solar return. I hadn't thought of that before, but I really like that idea, and it makes me want to experiment with that. What I will do is I'll spot when a good solar election is. I'm always looking for solar elections. And there was a beautiful one this year because so the sun is exalted in Aries, and during Aries season this year, and by the way, when someone says sun sign season, it just means the sun is in that sign. Or when someone says Aries season, it means the sun is in the sign of Aries. So in Aries season this year, Jupiter was also in Aries. So this is a lineup that only happens every 12 years or so. So it felt very rare. Jupiter is known as the greater benefic. So it's an extra auspicious time to do solar workings. And there was a very special day when the sun was very close to Jupiter, applying to Jupiter in Aries, actually very close to the exalted degree of the sun. So they're also exalted degrees, not just signs. And anyways, it was very special. And so I did pull out all the shots for that in terms of, a full altar with full flowers. And I think I was wearing gold, and I ended up working with a table of the sun. So the planetary tables is also something that people can Google or people can look at in Agrippa. It can be a way to create a talisman, or just to tune into that energy. I almost like to think of it as tuning a radio. So what a table is, it's like, depending on the planet, it'll have that number of squares. So the table of Saturn, for example, Saturn is associated with the number 3 in this tradition. So it'll have 3 by 3 squares. With the sun, it's 6. So 6 by 6 squares. And all of these numbers are rooted in the Kabbalah and Kabbalic correspondences, because magic around that century was very, very leaky with the Kabbalah and with other traditions. So this to say, I will pull out all the shots, but it will often be when I've elected a day. It won't necessarily be a Wheel of the Year day or something that happens every year. I very much honor the sun on the solstice, but it almost feels less spoken and less performed and more internal. The equinox too, the spring equinox, is really important for me, partly because that is the beginning of Aries season, and living somewhere right now very cold still in March. I mean, I live in Montreal normally, and it feels like a victory to reach Aries season because the snow is on its way out. There will still be blizzards. There will, in the case of this year, still be catastrophic ice storms, but the snow is losing that battle when it comes to Aries season. I find, as much as I love summer solstice, I can find it bittersweet because I'm like, oh, but now the light is ebbing again. Yeah. Saying that, I'm right now in Dawson City, and for the first time in my life, I'm experiencing 24-hour daylight, and I'm actually like, I miss the night. I miss the moon. I haven't seen the moon in a month. I have not seen stars in a month. It's weird. So,
wow. Yeah, there is that. Are there certain myths or stories or deities that you like to associate with the sun that people could use as inspiration, or to like kind of maybe give it a relatable personality or a narrative that they could relate to?
I mean, the archetypes that come to mind, there are a few of them. One of them is Apollo, another is Helios, which was more the personification of the sun in the Greek pantheon, whereas Apollo was the god who ended up being associated with the sun. What I will say is I actually don't love the Greco-Roman treatments of the sun, or at least they're kind of boring. Like I feel like not boring, let me rephrase this. It feels like the man. That's also not a great way. I feel like I'm pissing off the sun right now, but I think there is this distinction. I use this language myself, between diurnal thinking and nocturnal thinking, or like someone who one might perceive as more solar versus someone one might perceive as more nocturnal or lunar. And the sun is that person who is, successful in all of the ways that we perceive success to be. Like they might be highly visible, they might be a public figure, they might have all of these things going for them on paper. And I would say the moon is more intuitive, it's more transgressive in certain ways. There's a darkness to the moon, or a shadowiness, which I find quite alluring. And I think that our lunar and nocturnal capacities can be very undervalued in this society. I mean, one obvious example is I would associate the sun with physical health, as mentioned, but like physiological health, going to the doctor, things you can see, like I've broken my arm, please fix me. But compare that, not that Western medicine is in an all of a healthy state on its own. I think there are a lot of problems, but still compare that and the resources we have there to our mental health resources, and how under-supported we are, and how there's such a lack of funding, such a lack of understanding of what depression is, or anxiety or other concerns. So I can struggle. I actually don't associate with the Greco-Roman personifications of the sun as much, because to me they represent parts of society that I might aspire to them in one more superficial way. I am very achievement oriented and ambitious, and I am a very solar person, for better or worse. But I also feel like I want to, like, the moon is more subversive, and I want to nurture that side of myself as much. Saying that, I think that we can look to other cultures as well. So the Celtic pantheon has some interesting solar deities. Belenus is one. I don't know much about Belenus's stories, but I know that deity is associated with Beltane in the Wheel of the Year. I was also reading about this British goddess Sulis, who is associated with the sun, and one of the syncretic names she was known under was Sulis Minerva, which just sounds badass. And she was the goddess who presided over the hot springs at Bath. But what it says there is, if you look up who Sulis was, she was like the goddess of healing, hot springs, and curses. I just love that. As like,
yeah.
I trust the Celts, and maybe most pantheons aside from the Greco-Roman pantheons, to like combine those things. And you would have like people would leave these what do you call them, tablets at the springs, like listing the curses that they had for other people. There's one that's like, so and so stole my gloves, I'd like you to take away his vision.
Oh gosh. That's so funny.
What
do you think of when you think of gender in the sun? Because I know that some cultures think of the sun as more of a like coded masculine, and the moon as coded feminine, whereas others, like in the Norse pantheon, we have Sunna, who's a solar deity of healing, and yeah, I think it's in the German pantheon, same kind of thing, where solar deities are often women and the moon was coded as masculine. So do you relate to the sun with a particular gender, consciously or unconsciously, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I'm all for queering the planets, so I'm all for just using whatever pronouns resonates for you. I love actually using she pronouns for Saturn, and resonating with Saturn as a feminine force. I think that can help us befriend Saturn in some ways, because otherwise Saturn can be even more austere. But if you perceive Saturn as this powerful crone figure, I like Saturn more in that form, rather than this crusty old man that we also think of Saturn as.
Right.
For the sun, I'm not saying this is my recommendation, but I think I do subconsciously absorb some of the more masculine coding, as and also in terms of it representing the father in some ways.
Hmm.
But it could also be the parent that you perceive. This is where it gets really tricky. Because I think that I mean, parents themselves, I don't think it even makes sense to describe parents' roles as being masculine or feminine necessarily anymore. I think that there's so much blurring, which is healthy. I feel like the more blurred, the better. Um, when I'm writing about the planets, I'm just used to now doing what we do at Chani, which is describing them all as it and not favoring one or the other, or you could say them. I guess what I'm saying is subconsciously, I think I've absorbed the masculine coding, but I think whatever people want to use, they should use. I
Mm-hmm.
like the idea of the sun being a feminine presence.
Yeah, I can really see both, and maybe it depends on what kind of working I'm doing. Because, of
Mm-hmm.
course, if we think of warmth, I think of like Bridget as both, a bardic deity, which is very much about like being seen and commanding an audience. Also, she was the goddess of smithery, so like
Mm-hmm.
blacksmithing and working
And
with fire
healing
and the
too.
hearth, and also healing. So there's
Mm-hmm.
like a kind of fierceness, but also a warmth there that I think, so when I think of solar deities, I actually very often think of Bridget as one. I
Mm-hmm.
also think of Anya, who's Irish,
Mm-hmm.
who has that creative, kind of effusive solar energy to
Mm-hmm.
me. But then I also kind of have subconsciously, I think, absorbed like Lu, and who's the namesake of Lunasa, which
Mm-hmm.
is very oriented towards like prowess and competence and excellence and the will towards um, excellence in craft and in performance. That seems very solar to me as well. Though when I'm doing my propitiations on Sundays, I use my daily deck for tarot is the Mythic Tarot by Juliet Sharman Burke and Liz Green. So it's really nice to have these sort of psychological astrologers who've
Mm-hmm.
worked with the Greek pantheon, and so I really appreciate the image of Apollo on Sundays, representing again like the will towards consciousness and excellence and intellect and performance of not only excellence but also beauty and radiance, and the radiance that comes from knowing who you really are, self-knowledge. I appreciate that too. So I think I try to be as encompassing as possible when I think about the sun and the deities, just to make sure that I have like a nice mix in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for naming Bridget. Bridget is one of the first, I know I didn't name her, but it's also one of the first deities that I think of when I think of the sun. But that's almost been actually what you've said is very affirming, because I've almost wondered if I've just made it so in my mind, or because I so associate her with the sun, but then I wasn't sure if other people did too. And so I actually went through a process when I was preparing for this where I was like, I don't know if technically she counts, but I associate her with the sun. Anyway, what you've said is affirming to me.
That's great. I also think of Hestia as well, because I think
Mm,
pretty much any fire deity is going to come under solar influence, obviously. Like to me, it seemed like you said
yeah.
so nicely, like the candle is the sister to the sun. And so definitely Hestia, because I was born under the asteroid Vesta, that seems like really
Mm-hmm.
important to me to have moments of acknowledgement. And so I think of whenever I'm propitiating Hestia, which is like whenever I wash my stovetop, like clean it of oils, and I'll take like a little bit of olive oil on my finger and just kind of smear it as like a little offering to Hestia before I cook again. And I think of that as a solar propitiation, which I sometimes that's my sort of backup. If I haven't had a chance to draw my cards or anything like that, then whenever it comes time for me to eat something, if I'm like using the oven or just anything, I'll just think of like smearing a little bit of olive oil on the cooktop as my first offering to Hestia. Um, Yeah, I'm trying to think
I
of
love
other
that.
deities that would go.
I want to do that. I'm going to start doing that, in fact.
Nice.
Well, I mean, again, the pantheon that really focuses on the sun that comes to mind, though I haven't mentioned it yet, is the Egyptian pantheon. And there you have Ra. But what's really interesting is what I've noticed across cultures is there can be an association with the sun and the eye. And so in the Egyptian pantheon, you have the eye of Ra, and actually that was seen to be a feminine counterpart or even consort to Ra, and often taking the form of Hathor or Sekhmet or Bastet or others. But I think recognized as being just as powerful. But it was this the eye of Ra, like, which sounds itself quite daunting and intimidating in some ways.
Yeah.
But you see that too with the Greco-Roman tradition, where you have in the Orphic hymn to the sun, it invokes the eye a few times. It actually begins, I have it up here, it begins, here golden Titan, whose eternal eye with matchless sight illumines all the sky. So there's this correlation of the sun and sight, obviously, because with the sun, things are elucidated. We can see things with our eyes. The sun also, in terms of body parts, rules the right eye traditionally, whereas the moon rules the left eye. And actually, I mentioned Sulis before, the British goddess of the bath spring. That word is actually cognate with a Celtic word that means eye too. So across all of these very different traditions, there's this association with the sun and the eye, or an eye. And you can see that in the sky. I can see how it would have this oracular quality to it,
Totally.
but not an unintimidating one. This eye burning into you in some ways.
Well, and when you look up, if you were to catch a glimpse of the sun and then you close your eyes, you know, you can like see the solar ring kind of thing in your eye. It kind of is like burned into your vision, right? It must also carry, it does carry those kinds of like inescapable qualities. Like even when the sun goes away, we miss it because the coolness comes, and then we're like yearning for the morning time to come. It has such immensity, and it's so important that I can see it being both like a warmth and a security, and feeling reassured by the illumination. We can see what's happening, whereas at nighttime, you know, the shadows can conceal all kinds of dangers, but at the same time it can be so scorching. And so there's no maybe privacy, or there's no escape, it can seem, I imagine. I'm thinking of like the ancient psyche of how important and how pervasive the sun is, and just that you definitely wouldn't take it for granted.
No, especially for cultures or societies dependent on farming and on using the sun to cultivate their food. But what you said reminded me of something. One practice that I really like and resonate with is finding a way to identify with the sun, or resonate with the sun and its 4 stations. So imagining the solar quality being different at sunrise versus noon versus sunset versus midnight, and even perhaps imagining a different deity for each of those, or a different face of that deity for each of those. And you might find that there's one that you resonate with more. I think the midnight sun, not here, because the midnight sun literally is still almost a noon sun somewhere else. But when you imagine the sun and where it is at midnight, it's not gone. It hasn't left. We just can't see it. So what does it mean to have this force of light and life and strength that we can't see, but we know it's still burning just under the earth, or just far enough away from the horizon that it's not filling our sky with light, but there's still a presence there. And there might be a more introverted sun, you could say. I can really resonate with that sometimes. Or with the sun at sunset, or the sun at sunrise, which has this, bursting quality, a more youthful quality. The sun at sunset has this more elder quality. There's a wisdom to it. The high noon sun is the CEO of all the suns. It's the more Apollonian one, I would say.
Right.
But I think we can read different character traits into the sun depending on where it is in the chart. And you can do this in your birth chart if you know what time of day you were born, depending on this season. Do you have your sun at the very top of the chart, like at the high noon of the chart? Or were you born at night? Were you a night baby? In which case you might resonate with your moon more, or you might resonate with a quieter version of the sun. So I think that could be another way we build relationship with it.
So you've mentioned some colors and some herbs. We've talked about some myths and deities. Are there other associations or maybe resources for associations with the sun that you think would be good for people to investigate?
Yeah, I do think a few of the texts that I've mentioned, if people want to get into AstroMagic, I recommend getting a copy of the Pikatrix or getting a copy of Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, and that will go planet by planet, very detailed, more detailed than you want. Breakdown of what each of their characteristics are and how to woo them. Another practice that comes to mind from another tradition, and I also want to be mindful of mixing and matching and appropriation and all of these other things, but I do think cultures all around the world have honored the sun for very good reason, and there is something meaningful in doing these other practices. But one of the ones that comes to mind is, sun salutations. You can do like that movement for I don't know how many centuries or millennia has been a sort of bodily propitiation to the sun, or a bodily honoring of the sun. There's something also about that, about being prostrate, like being like lying on the ground. That's very humble, and also very close to the earth. It can be very grounding. But there's something about a movement practice that leads you to be in such a position of really devotion towards this greater entity, or a greater entity, or an entity, at least, whether you perceive them as greater or not, or just part of you, the divine part of you. This to say, I have also done that, like on the day of the equinox, trying to do a certain number of sun salutations, or and making that a sacrifice or an offering on its own. So I think there are so many ways that you can engage with that archetype in particular, probably more so than most other planets, because it's one of the ones that's so obvious. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And I would say for those of us who don't feel comfortable with yoga or doing those kinds of things, the salutation or the greeting of the sun and the moon are important to both my husband and I, as just a thing we will do out in the world. And maybe the sacrifice is with my dignity. I don't know, because it might look weird to my neighbors or whoever. When I go outside my door and I see the sun, I kiss my palm and I put my palm up as though I'm saying hello to the sun. And that actually does come from, there are ancient Greek statues. Oh, maybe it was Roman. Well, anyway, ancient statues in the Greco-Roman world that would face east or sometimes west, but they would have their hands up as though they were waving, and they would all be sort of directionally oriented to where the sun would be seen. And I find it very touching and tender to go oh, hello, sun, hello, moon, by kissing my palm and waving. So you literally can just greet the sun,
Oh,
even just good morning out of your eastern window, and enjoy your coffee, just looking at the sun coming across the city or wherever you are. I think that's a really very personal moment that you can have with such a vast celestial luminary. I think it's a really nice personal thing to do,
Just noticing. It sounds so obvious, but I think we live in a society that can be so divorced from these simple natural cues. Just noticing what side of the city or what side of the land does the sun come up on, and knowing that that's east, and where does it go down. And that might be obvious for some people, but if you're traveling, at least if you're me with my sense of direction, it's not necessarily obvious. And again, especially here in Dawson, where I'm mostly experiencing the sun overhead or vaguely west and overhead, but still very high. And I had the experience this morning where I am actually trying to, because the sun does not go away, I have to be very careful about my sleep, and I'm being very intentional about looking at the sun in the morning or looking at getting daylight early in the morning to cue my circadian rhythm to then help me fall asleep when it's time to fall asleep, because it
Right.
will still look like it's 2 p.m. outside. Um, but I got up this morning around 6:30 or 7 and just looked for the sun, and it wasn't actually, it was very bright outside. It looked like it could have been 2 p.m. outside, but the sun hadn't risen over the hills yet. It was just starting to come up. I'm not quite at the Arctic Circle. I think at the Arctic Circle or further north, it's not actually going down. But it was baffling to me where I was like, you were over there this whole time, and now I don't see you. Like, now you're coming up from there. Where did you go? And I was just sleeping, obviously. But it was still weird because the sun's moving so slowly when it's
Yeah.
daylight, because it's taking forever to go down. And then in the nighttime, which I think here is between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. or something, it just spins underground. This is my subjective experience.
Wild. Yeah, exactly. So the last question I want to ask you is once again about grief and rage. But what I would like to know is, do you think the sun can support us in our grief and our rage?
Yes, definitely. Definitely. So it's funny, as I was thinking about this, the back of my mind, when you suggested we might talk about this. And one of the ways that now seems very obvious to me is, this might sound graphic or maybe macabre to some people, but literally how we dispose of bodies sometimes is involving fire. It can be involving cremation, but how can we work with that in our own lives? I think the act of burning something is very cathartic. So if you're angry, writing an angry letter and burning it in a bonfire, or letters you no longer want, or papers you no longer want, and burning those in a bonfire, I think that can be very such a release, such a psychological and emotional release, and very purifying. I think also we can work with fire not purely as a destroyer and a purifier, but as a source of warmth and of comfort. There is something for me very comforting about a candle flame. So lighting a candle or multiple candles at night, or if you're lucky enough to have a fireplace or a fire pit outside, gathering around, I think that can be a more soothing and gentler way to work with your grief or your rage. Also, the sun is so uplifting, and literally it comes up every morning. Like it's never, well, again, depending on where you're located and what time of year it is, but more or less it is reliably cyclical, and it reliably returns. And there is something very hopeful about that. And I think when we can be in pits of despair, something like that can maybe keep us tethered to the idea that there will be another day, and that this situation is temporary, and that these feelings are temporary. So I think that the sun could be it can be a buoy for us in times of grief and of rage.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think about candles at vigils as a way of like keeping vigil and keeping the ember of somebody's spirit alight. That's a
Yeah.
beautiful way of thinking of that. And it's true. Like, yeah, for us, the sun has a pretty quick cycle, like a daily or annual. And it's like, yeah, that's probably a pretty good metric for like this too shall pass, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much, Eliza. As I said, you've been totally like a primary influence for me in going deeper into this. You also have recommended really great astro magicians, and this is how I came to know about Sphere and Sundry, and the AstroMagic and the ephemera available. I don't know if that's the right word, but like the materia magica that you can get there, and I'll link to them because Yeah, there's a lot of information on their website as well, but you've always just been a wealth of information and support, and it's a delight to be able to share this with everybody. And thank you for kicking off our month of planetary magic.
Thank you. It is my pleasure and my honor to be here, and it's just such a delight to spend an hour or two talking about the sun with you. So thank you so
Yay!
much for thinking of me.
Okay, so to clarify, Merriam-Webster defines propitiation as the act of gaining or regaining the favor or goodwill of someone or something. So the act of propitiation is related to appeasement or sacrifice to propitiate the gods. So it could be asking, but it sounds like there's definitely a sacrifice or an offering part of it as well. So there you have it. I looked it up. Also, in the show notes for today's episode, you'll find a link to the Picatrix, which was published in 1250 based on a lost Arabic manuscript, which may have been from around 1000. And then the 3 books of occult philosophy, there's 2 different versions we'll offer, links to kind of the cheaper one, as well as the splurge option of the hardcover 3-book slipcase set. The 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa were originally published in 1531. As I mentioned at the top of the show, Eliza's new book, I Got a Name, seeks to bring justice to a woman named Crystal Senek, who was murdered by her best friend's abusive partner after she helped her friend get into a transition house. It was riveting. I read it in 2 sittings. It's based in the Yukon. Congratulations to Eliza on her excellent and very respectful retelling of Crystal's story. I also really appreciated all the mystical and magical elements that appear throughout the book as well. We didn't talk about that in this episode, but I just want to mention that it's the magic is afoot there. So I'd love to see that magic continue with people reading the book and talking about it. As always, a listener shout out. I want to offer a big thank you and acknowledgement recognition to someone named Megan, who left a review for my book, The Spirited Kitchen, on Goodreads. Megan gave it 5 stars and wrote, "This book is incredible. It is visually stunning and bursting with magic. I've been waiting for a book like this for years. The recipes are the kind you'll be so proud to serve to all the people you love the most. This is so much more than a cookbook. It is an invitation to connect deeply to the seasons and the natural world and create something beautiful and nourishing to honor that bond. This book will be an instant classic. Be sure to savor every page." Oh, Megan, that was beautiful. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you to everyone who's offered a review. Please go and review if you've read my book. I'd love to hear. I totally do read them again and again. If you want to go a bit deeper in your relationship with the planets, come hang out with us in the Numinous Network. Our focus in the Numinous School in July is AstroMagic, and in August, it's connecting with and working with plants. I was talking in a tutorial recently about the 4 pillars of a spiritual life, and those 4 pillars are study, mentorship, a practice, and a community to practice with. And you'll find all 4 of those things available to you in the Numinous Network, where we have on-demand video courses as well as live events that cross-pollinate science, spirituality, somatic healing, and trauma recovery. We'd love to support you on your journey. You can learn more at carmenspagnola.com. CarmenSpagnola. Until next time, take care.